Edmund Burke's ideas are seen as foundational for modern conservatism, at least in the Anglosphere, the English speaking world. And many of the more learned Tories in this country call themselves Burkean conservatives. But how much of the policies and attitudes and practices of modern conservative parties in the West can be derived from Burkean principles? Most conservative political parties operate within and seek to defend, or say they seek to defend, democratic principles, and Burke did not. Whatever modern Burkean conservatives might say, Burke did not believe in a people's right to form their own government. He believed in hereditary government of a king and a nobility and the whole social hierarchy. Some would say the Conservative Party in this country since the 1970s have not really been conservative in the Burkean sense. They're liberals. They are seeking to defend economically liberal principles of free market, limited government. Margaret Thatcher, a heroine of contemporary conservatives, much more so than Burke, in an interview in 1987, she laid down her philosophy and her governing principles, and she came up with a statement that has really come to define Thatcherism and define conservatism since Thatcher. She said, "There is no such thing as society." That was her famous phrase. She said, "I think we've gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it. Or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I'm homeless, the government must house me." So they are casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. For Edmund Burke, there was such a thing as society. The social structures and social institutions that made up society was part of our heritage, and that's what made us politically peaceable, and that's what made us happy. That's where our satisfactions in life came from. It came from the role that we played within a larger social structure. And Burke came up with a phrase that has, in a different way, become influential to an even more recent strand of conservative ideas. He talked about the little platoons in which citizens were enlisted from birth. A platoon, as you know, is a subsection of the army. It's the smallest unit of any army. It's the group of people that a soldier actually knows and works with. And Burke said, in society as well, there are platoons. The local community, the people that we see every day and that we associate with and live beside and work with. This is the fundamental unit of society, and this is where we get our satisfactions from, and this is what we owe our loyalty to. Burke said, "To love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It is the first link in a series by which we proceed towards a love of our country and to mankind. The interest of that portion of social arrangement is a trust in the hands of those who compose it. And as none but bad men would justify it in abuse, none but traitors would barter it away for their own personal advantage." And bartering it away for their own personal advantage is what he thought the French revolutionaries had done. They had got rid of social institutions and let loose a kind of libertinism, kind of licentiousness in which everyone is out for their own gain. This is what he thought these social hierarchies protected us against. This was in a section that was defending the nobility. A lot of people these days who only read the quote and not the whole thing don't admit this. It was the nobility for Burke that defined in some way these communities, these platoons. So These local communities were very much a platoon with a commander, a nobleman. It was the nobleman who grouped people together into these little organic communities, the kind of nobility that were getting their heads chopped off in France in the Revolution. But the whole notion of our little platoons, these small local communities that make up the larger civic community, and the idea that politics should be organized locally has become quite influential to a more recent form of Toryism, as I say. There was an initiative in the David Cameron government, the coalition government, um, a kind of group of policies and a guiding political philosophy called the Big Society, which took its inspiration from Burke's ideas about the little platoons. Cameron sought to foster community organization, that voluntary sense of cooperation for common goals within real face to face relationships. The Big Society initiative was a kind of reaction within the Tory party against that Thatcherite idea that everyone was looking out for themselves first. It was a return to what they saw as the roots of modern conservatism in the ideas of Edmund Burke. They wanted to replace government services not with private businesses for profit, but with local voluntary initiatives. There were, and this included lots of different policies. There were awards given for community activism and a community bank to fund local charitable causes. But this didn't last long, and it's now a decade old, and no one ever talks about it anymore. But it was seen as quite important at the time. But I think because it came alongside the 2008 financial crash and the enormous retraction of the economy, which was accompanied by a corresponding retraction of the state. Entitlements were rolled back and austerity measures were imposed. And for this reason, the Big Society was seen by many as just simply the government trying to get people to do for free what the government used to provide for at one time themselves. But some people have found ways to bring Burkean ideas into discussion around precisely those events that happened in 2008 when the world financial system came crashing down. The government imposed austerity. But what it also did was to get itself into horrendous amounts of debt. Who are they in debt to? Well, it's the future generations. And this is what led some people to say that the kind of debt that was amassed in the wake of the crash was a kind of sundering of the intergenerational social contract. Neil Ferguson, who's a conservative historian but who writes about contemporary issues, he applied Burke's ideas to this contemporary situation. He says, something is amiss with our political institutions. The most obvious symptom of the malaise is the huge debts we have managed to accumulate in recent decades. And he goes on to cite lots and lots of facts and figures. And then he says, these mind-boggling numbers represent nothing less than a vast claim by the generation currently retired or about to retire on their children and grandchildren, who are obligated by current law to find the money in the future. In his Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790, Edmund Burke wrote that the real social contract is not Rousseau's contract between the sovereign and the people, or general will, but the partnership between the generations. Society, says Burke, is indeed a contract. The state is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. In the enormous intergenerational transfers implied by current fiscal policies, we see a shocking and perhaps unparalleled breach of precisely that partnership. The government in the UK and the US and many other places, but not just the government, but the electorate, the people, or the The people who are doing most of the buying and spending and decision making over the last decades, they've got themselves into a kind of debt that they themselves will never repay. You millennials or Gen Zs will have to spend a lot of your income paying off the debts that older generations have accrued. How do you feel about that? Do you think Burke's ideas are helpful in addressing this? I want you to have a think about this before we meet, and I want you to have a think about some other questions which I'm going to leave up here for you.